April Saupe. Like Rob said, I'm like the lead engineer of front-end development at Deseret Book. And so my talk today is on the Solidus API and how we can take it from not just the Solidus that we know, but how we can move Solidus to progressive web apps, to native, and even beyond from there. So I think before we get started, all right, we'll just do it this way. So before we get started, I want to give sort of a context on our company and sort of what brought us to like e-commerce and sort of our history, right? And so our company's been around since 1866. And if you do the math, like you'll realize that we probably didn't start out as an e-commerce store. And because of that, we actually have over 40 retail stores, right? And so we have retail stores, authorized resellers, and we even do like events, and so we have pop-up stores. And so most people think of us as a retail store and not necessarily e-commerce. And aside from that, we actually sell over 30,000 products. And so it's not just books, right? We say Deseret Book, but we actually sell things from lanterns, dish towels, bookmarks, jump ropes, and pretty much anything you can think of, we probably sell it. So we are a book publisher, but we're also pretty into music and movies as well. And surprisingly, I would consider ourselves an app developer. So because we sell ebooks and audiobooks and these other media things, we're actually, like we have an ebook and audiobook apps, right? So we call this bookshelf, and that's sort of like users will come in and they'll buy our ebooks and audiobooks, and then they can go to our app and they can consume them. And so now, like, let's get in a little bit more on the e-commerce side of Deseret Book. So we've more or less been selling stuff online since '96. And so we've probably been doing it before, but this is just as far back as the Wayback Machine would give me. And so we were using something called iShopper, but don't Google it because I tried and I couldn't actually find it, so it doesn't exist anymore. But this is what Deseret Book looked like in the '90s. So if we fast forward 20 years, this was in 2016 is when we moved from Spree to Solidus. And so we had the Solidus front end, and it was basically like a direct port of Spree to Solidus, right? And that was sort of how we were doing all of our e-commerce stuff. And then we have this bookshelf, right? And this is sort of our media consumption. And what it does is this actually talks a lot to Solidus, and that's how we get like product information, taxons, and user purchase history, right? And then we sort of pass that along to the apps to say, okay, this is the media that you can consume, and this is information about it. So this is sort of our architecture, right? Like we have Solidus at the top, and it passes data down to our bookshelf, to our media API, and then it passes it down to our iOS, Android, and web apps. And you know, this is pretty good, but as we started going, like we realized that like all of our users want bigger and better features on the e-commerce side, right? Like with Amazon, like things are changing on the internet, and every time we add a new feature, users always say like, hey, why can't you be more like Amazon? And when users say that, like what they're really saying is, hey, why don't you guys write more JavaScript? Why don't you start pulling more data with Ajax? And why don't you stop using I like searches? So then we realized, like, why can't we, like, at this time, like, we were using, like, we were defacing the front end, like, just using, like, the true Solidus front end, and we were defacing it, and we were trying to, like, we had all this jQuery soup, and it was just really hard for us to add features for our users. So then what we decided was, well, what if we started moving to a progressive web app, where, you know, we'll take our views and we'll render them with something like React, and we'll just sort of dump the data to React and let them handle it. And this is sort of like what our architecture looks like at the moment, right? Like we're still converting some of our stuff to React, but that's sort of what we're doing, is trying to deprecate our usage of the Solidus front end. But you know, now after this, it sort of gets us thinking like, well, if we're going to do that, like, do we even need Rails to render the front end? And at the same time, like, well, if we're going to be doing that, like, do we even need this middleman of our media API to be passing the data back and forth about products and taxons and stuff? Or can we just have our mobile apps talk directly to Solidus to get that kind of information, so that our media API is only handling the media consumption aspect of it, and then Solidus handles all the product information? Like, is this possible? Like, how realistically, how can we do this? And you know, at the same time, like, what if we want to expand, and what if we want to have more apps? What if we want to have e-commerce apps on Android and iOS that talk directly to iOS. Like, how realistic is this, like, if we want to do this? And you know what, because we have 30,000 products, what if we wanted to take a subset of those and sell them like under a different brand or on a different site, right? Like, Solidus calls these multi-tenancy, and we consider them like microsites, right? And so, like, obviously this is a thing in Solidus, but how, under this sort of architecture, how realistic is it for us to be able to do this? And because we have over 40 stores, like we have all this product stuff and we have like sales, like how realistic is it for us to build a point of sale? Like, can we do physical sales with Solidus? And you know, we have all these enterprise things, right? Like, we do warehouse stuff, and like I guess we manage our own warehouse, and I hear all these acronyms like in meetings and stuff, like ERP and WMS, and like for me, like I have no clue what it does, but they tell me that it's like super important, but really for me, it's just magic. And so we have all these things, right? Like enterprise stuff is just like, it talks to Solidus, and I'm just like, okay, but this is a thing, right? And it's something that we have to consider in our architecture. So this is a question that we ask ourselves basically every day at work, is what are the limits of Solidus? Like, can we build progressive web apps with Solidus? Can we do native? Can we do physical sales? Can we integrate with our enterprise? And how well can we really do it? Like, what are the limits? And so, you know, as we started thinking of this, like we realized, like, sort of our best bet to like do all of these things is with the Solidus API. And I think a lot of people don't actually know that Solidus has an API, but turns out it does, right? And so these are some numbers that I got with grep, right? Like, you guys should be so proud of me. Like, I use grep, but don't fact check my numbers because, like, I don't know. So this is just, it's a good general guide of sort of what the state is, right? So it's REST-based, and there's something like 270 endpoints currently available with just like the vanilla Solidus. And those are spread over like 30 controllers. And if you look at the models and like take out all the through tables and stuff, like there's something like a third of the models are like accessible directly with the API. So then our real question is, like, is it good enough for all of those things? Like, can we really do all of those things with the API? Like, how good really is it? And every time we mention the API, I think everybody sort of asks us, like, well, why don't you just use GraphQL? Like that's so hot right now, right? Like everybody's using GraphQL. Like, we should just use GraphQL. And you know, it's a valid question, right? Like, why don't we use GraphQL? And there's some reasons why we ended up not going with GraphQL yet, right? Like, so the community is currently supporting GraphQL, and it says right here, like, it says it's work in progress. And so, you know, support is currently in early stages, and you know, the API, it already exists theoretically, right? Like, so if we were to go to GraphQL, like, we'd have to have some of our backend devs like supporting it. Whereas, like, if we just go with the API, like, theoretically, like, it's done, right? Like, our front-end devs can just go add features and use it, like, GG done. So theoretically, like, that's good. And you know what? We already have all this experience with other REST APIs, right? And so it's just like, we're already sort of shifting our paradigm to be like a React focus, and we don't want to like alienate too many of our developers too fast. So really, at the end of the day, like, we just didn't want to rock the boat too much. And so that was sort of our reason of saying, like, hey, let's just hold off on changing too many things too quick, and let's go with the REST API. And so we're going to do sort of our first impressions. And what I want to do is, this is basically a post-mortem for us of just our experience. So I just want to give some context and background on that experience. And basically, so I just want to say, like, the API, like, I'm going to spoiler alert, like, the API we think it's in a really good place. Obviously, there's room for improvement, but we know that, like, people put a lot of hard work, so I don't want to sound like I'm, like, complaining or anything, right? Like, I think it's great. So this is just, like, our experience, and we're going to talk about the things that we screwed up with, and things that hopefully the community can learn from our mistakes. And so we started a move to an API base around a year ago. And our first objective was to redo our checkout flow using the API. And so about a year ago, when we first got started, like, this was our docs, right? Like, we would take controllers and we would take specs and the routes, and that was about all we had for documentation. And so there really wasn't much for us to go off. And you know, we had all these endpoints, but we didn't really know how to, like, put them together. And so it was really just a lot of trial and error of us just, like, hitting an endpoint and throwing data at it and seeing what came back. And so what we figured out was, like, you know, we would hit these endpoints, and the first thing that we would get back is this response, like, you must specify an API key. And we're just like, what the heck is an API key? And so it turns out that, like, all all requests from the API, like by default, require you to have an API key. So like user or admins are assigned an API key, right? But you can change it so like every user is assigned an API key. Anyway, so there's this config thing that is sort of hidden that you can change, right? You can just switch it to say like, oh yeah, we don't want to require authentication. And this makes it so like the product endpoints can be accessible by anyone, but things like orders and users are still require authentication. And so what we realized was like the token or so the API keys are really good for things like an admin import thing or something like some dev tool, but like API keys aren't really good on like a client side, right? And so like, because like if you think about it, like if you assign an API key to a user and then that's sort of their API key, right? So it's like, what happens when that API key is compromised? Like, do you call up your user and be like, hey, you need to cancel all your credit cards because your API key is compromised? That's not really cool, right? And so what we ended up doing was we wrote a gem called Solidus JWT, and that was so we could support JSON web tokens. So just like an alternative to authenticating with the API. And so as we started thinking about it, right, like it turns out there's not really any versioning in the API, which this is fine when you're doing like web apps, right? Because every time a user comes into the app, like you just reload the newest version of the app, and that's great, right? But when you start thinking about things like native apps, like you sort of bundle up all your code and you just give it out, and if somebody downloads that, like that's the version of the app that they have. And if you dump a new version of your app and somebody does, and they don't necessarily have to be updating it, and so you sort of have to like support these older versions of the app, right? You sort of decide like, I'm going to support this version of the app for n number of months, right? So like at Desert Book, we have something like 5 or 6 versions of our app that we're currently like watching, right? And those were all released over the last several months. And so it's like, you know, if we wanted to make a breaking change, something that we feel is like great to the response type, right? Like that might alienate and like break one of our old versions of the app. And another thing about versioning is like, you know, when we start thinking about like client-side needs, like when we're displaying a list of products, like the data that we return for clients might be different than what we need for the enterprise integrations. And this is where people are like, oh yeah, well we could use GraphQL for that. And yeah, that's a good point. Like that's one of the benefits of GraphQL. But you know what? We already have the API. And so like, since it already exists, we're not just going to throw it out, right? Like in favor of GraphQL, like we might as well just make it better. And so this is just one of the things that we realized that like, hey, this is an area where we can improve. So another thing, as we started doing this, right, we sort of just ran into a bunch of little like quirk things where it's like, oh, this doesn't quite work as well as we would expect it to. And so this is an example of some sort of like an unexpected behavior. So it turns out this is like the order create method. Using the API, and so basically, if an admin comes in and tries to create an order, like they hit the order importer, whereas like a regular user just creates a regular order. And so I don't know about you guys, but like our admins dog food our app, right? Meaning like they come in and they actually buy stuff from our store, and so that means that like if our admins try to like buy stuff on our store, like they might run into these kind of issues. So we just ran into like all these little like quirkiness. Which, I mean, it makes sense, like we need an importer, but like maybe that kind of thing should live in a different endpoint. So that's sort of like our first impressions, right? You know, we didn't really have much documentation to go off of. We weren't quite sure how to authenticate, and we were sort of unsure of like what the best practices were to like version our responses and how to like manage those. And there were just little things about it. But you know, when we look at all of those issues that we ran into, like there's really only one source of our problem, and really that was just that we dove in too quick. Like I'm not saying the API is bad. We were like super hyper focused. Like it was just like we need to do checkout and we're going to use the API. Let's do it. And so we just sort of found the endpoints that we wanted and we dumped data at it and we just hit it. And we didn't really have anywhere to go for like documentation on how to like do checkout, right? And so we didn't stop and smell the roses. We didn't stop and look at the big picture of things. We just dove in too quick. And things have gotten a lot better since then. Like we now, like really recently, like we came out with these docs for the API, and they're like super great. Like I would have killed for these a year ago. So like I'm super excited that we have these, and it's an awesome start. And obviously there's like more room that we can do to improve this. But you know, for now, like it's really good. And so what I want to do now is like hopefully we've learned from our mistakes, right? And what I want to do is what we should have done all along and sort of do an analysis, big picture of what the API actually is. And the reason that I want to do that is because what we'll notice is there's lots of patterns that we can recognize as we do this. And the important part about patterns is as we look at them, it helps us to effectively learn how to use it, right? Because it's like, oh, once I learn this pattern, then I just keep following that pattern, right? And another thing that it does, it helps us find things that are missing. So we can say, hey, this endpoint, like this model has these type of endpoints, and this one doesn't. Like maybe this one should have those same things. You know, and it's like, oh, that's missing it. That's something where we can improve. And another reason for finding these patterns is it's super important for like extensions. Like we talked about extensions yesterday. And a lot of extensions can have or should have API support, right? And so we should be following the same patterns as a community to say, hey, these are the patterns in our API that we should all be following. And so as we develop our extensions and the APIs inside them, like we should be following these patterns so that everybody is sort of on the same page. So what this is right here, this is basically every endpoint in the API. And it doesn't matter if you can't read it. Like what we're going to look for is patterns, right? So what we have here, these are sort of we'll call them like endpoint groups, right? And so they sort of like represent like a model or some type of data. And then underneath of those are the endpoints that we can like manipulate that data, right? So we have like checkout and order and product and taxonomies and taxons, right? And then under those are the endpoints that we can do, or how we can interact with it, right? So we have like our index, right? This is our index, and it's how we get like all of something. And then the next one is like a get, right? And this is like our show method, and that's sort of like how we get a single instance of something. Then after that we have create, so we can like create a new instance of something. And then we have update, obviously, that's how we update it. After that we have a bunch of deletes, right? So that makes sense, right? This is just CRUD. But then something cool is like once there's a bunch of like one-offs, right? But what we notice is like there's this other one called new. And it's like, what does new do? Like, what's the difference between new and create? And it turns out new is a GET request. And it's like, well, how does that work? But turns out like what new does is you make a GET request. So we'll take option types, for instance, right? Like if you make a GET request on the new for option types, then that returns the permitted attributes. So basically what it does is it tells you how to create something. And so what we can do is we can sort of couple this with the create method to build our UI to allow users to sort of add these things, right? It's like how we build a form. So basically you call the new and say, hey, how do I build this form? And it says, great, here's what you need to build a form. You build it and then you let users fill it out, and then you call create to create it. And then it turns out edit, updates have the same thing, right? There's this edit method, and you say, hey, I have this thing, how do I edit it? And it says, oh, here's all the fields that you need to add. And it says, great, like here's the fields I have, and then you go to get like an instance, and you're like, okay, like here's my form, and then you call the update. So these are like patterns, like, okay, and like now I know a little bit better like how I can connect different endpoints together. And so then we can look at our index requests, like all of the index requests that we make. There's a few things that are similar between them, right? Like all of them except a queue, which is like a ransacked query, right? And this allows us to sort of like manipulate the data that is returned to it. And the next one is pagination. And like for us, like we have 30,000 products, right? And it's like you don't expect like every time a user comes to our page to just like dump 30,000 products on the page. Like that's gonna take forever. So pagination is like super important. It lets us say like, hey, here's the pages that we want, and here's how many results we want. Like give us a subset of this data. And what's cool is like the index response always comes back with like, here's pagination information, which allows us to build a UI that allows users to navigate that subset of data. And then we also have some patterns in our create and update requests. So it turns out like anytime we create or update something, like the attributes that we're gonna update or create should actually be nested inside. So like on an order endpoints, for instance, like we don't just dump the order like directly in the params that we're passing in, but we actually like nest it inside of an order property. And so another thing that like as we're doing this, like we run into like all these errors, right? Like every request we make isn't going to be perfect for one reason or another. And this was where like I had a lot of trouble with this initially, but because like we just dove in and it was just like trial and error, that I never like stopped and like looked at what the errors were. So I struggled way more with this than I should have. But if you like actually stop and look, there's only like 7 errors that you can get, which is not like, that's pretty good. And if you actually like take the 1 minute to like look at those, there's only like 2 different things that the response can give you. And the first one is like your error message. And that's just like a pretty message to show to errors when something goes wrong, right? And then if you do like an update or a create, and basically like the data that you passed was bad for whatever reason, like it passes this object of errors, and it's sort of just like a map between like the field name and the message related to it. And what we used to do was just like errors would come back and you just dump in the top in an alert. It's just like stuff went wrong, like you figure it out, like here you go. But what's cool is you can actually take this and couple it with like the new or the edit request that helped you build your form, and you can sort of map those permitted attributes with these error messages to sort of move your errors like more contextual into the app, which makes for a better UI. And another one, like another more patterns, right, is this, like we've documented now the checkout flow. And this is super legit of just like, here's how you take an order or a user from not having an empty cart to like fully moving it through the state machine, right? Like, so this is super great. And this is the kind of documentation that we need more of. Because this really lowers the barrier of entry for developers, right? Because like we struggled by just saying like we have all these endpoints, but how do they work together? And this is the kind of stuff that's like, hey, all users, like pretty much all e-commerce like goes through this process, right? Like this pattern. And so if we can document those kind of things more, like we'll end up building a better user experience for us as developers, and make it so that we can use the API a little bit better. So as we move on, like hopefully that gives you guys a little bit better overview of like what the API is, and sort of like how we can use it. So now that we've done that, like we'll talk a little bit more about how we interact with the API itself. And so if you remember, like basically we have these things and we want to be able to do this effectively, right? Like we want to be able to use the API in different environments, like web apps, native apps, lambdas, like whatever, right? Like pretty much anything you can think of, like we've thought of, like, can we do it, right? And so if you made like a Venn diagram of all the different languages that are supported in all those different things, like there's really only one answer of like thing in the middle, and that's JavaScript. So unfortunately, like a lot of people are just like, oh crap, JavaScript. But it turns out like you know, for a small team, like we only have like 8 developers. And we want to do all these things, right? And so it's like, it's really attractive to a small team to just sort of like narrow the number of languages that we use and narrow the number of tools that we write. And so it's like, if we can just use JavaScript for everything, like that's pretty good, right? It allows our developers to sort of jump around all those different projects a little bit easier. And so what we ended up doing was like, well, we'll build a JavaScript SDK. And so an SDK is a software developer kit. And basically it just means like a bunch of code that we wrote and shared, so that it makes it a little bit easier for us to develop using Solidus, right? Or using anything. And so before we started out, we set ourselves some goals. We wanted something that was consistent, so that, you know, the way you use it in one place is the way you would use it in everything, and the way that you use it between endpoints is all sort of similar, right? And we wanted something that was extensible, meaning that like everybody's instance of Solidus is different, and everybody uses different plugins and stuff. And we wanted something that was, you know, that would work for everybody. And we wanted something that was maintainable, something that we didn't spend all of our time developing, like something that helped us do our job, not that like wasted our time, right? And this goes the same thing with like developer friendly, something that was like easy for somebody to come in and be like, oh yeah, okay, I see how this works, and be able to move on and actually develop features rather than worry about how the SDK worked. So we ended up doing a few attempts with this, right? And so what I want to do is talk about some of our failed attempts to sort of give you a reasoning behind like our architecture of why we did things the way we did. And so our first attempt was just like functions, right? It's like, oh, cool, JavaScript, I'll just write a bunch of functions. And so every function that we write will sort of make one of these requests for us. So this is an example of like getting an order, right? But then we ran into all these problems of like, well, where do I pull data? Because it turns out like the path to get to something like requires like inherited data. So like for line items, like you would need like order information, and then you also need like the line item information. And then you might need like the information that you're going to pass to the API itself. And so we just ran into all these different issues, and there really wasn't extensible. And we were just fighting with ourselves. And really the only thing we did good was document it. And that was just because we took the time to write documentation for it. So our first attempt just wasn't great. And we decided to throw it out the door. So let's try again, right? Functions didn't work. What about classes? Like, that's cool. Like, JavaScript supports classes now. That'll be legit. And so we're like, cool, we'll have like this base class, and that'll handle all the like passing of data and stuff and the requests. And so what we'll do is we'll just like have these classes that extend that, right? That's cool. And then we'll write all these methods. So we'll write a method for every single endpoint, right? And every one of those will accept like parameters and like options on the request. And then I'll make this like generic request using the like extended class. That'll be so cool, right? And then we'll have like the nested ones, right? Like, so an order like has like nested line item endpoints, and that will just return like a new class. And then it'll pass like the order information. This will be super cool. And you know, usage would look a little bit something like this, right? Like, so we like initialize our SDK, and then we'll just like call all of these methods, right? So like the order method, we pass like order instance data to it, and then what that does is that returns like more endpoints that are accessible to us. And then so we'll call line item, which is another one of those, right? And then we'll pass line item instance data to it. And then what that's going to do is that's going to return a bunch of other endpoints that are available to us. And then finally, the last one's like, this is the one that actually returns data to you and actually makes the request. And what we ended up happening was, this was cool, and we really liked this syntax, right? And it was a little bit more consistent. But we ran into all these troubles with like extensions, because it was basically like, if you wanted to override line items for whatever reason, like you'd have to override line items, and then you'd have to go over to the order and override order to like inherit from the new line items one, and then you'd have to go back to the SDK to inherit the order one. And it was just like this huge mess, and it was just like, sometimes we felt like we were doing more maintenance of our SDK than we were actually like developing things. So attempt 2 was no bueno. And so attempt 3, we're like, okay, this is third time's the charm, right? Like, and we realized we were actually having these problems with all of our APIs, like not just Solidus. We realized like we have these patterns like in all of them. And so what we ended up doing was saying like, well, let's build some generic tool that allows us to write these SDKs not only for Solidus, but for everything. And we ended up building something called SDK Factory. So what we did was we built a wish list of things that we wished it would do, right? So we're like, well, we should make it schema-based so it's fast, it's easy for us to develop. Flexible, so meaning that like it will work with all of our stuff, not just Solidus. And plugin friendly, so that like we could use this to make it so that everybody can partake in it, right? And we want to be so proud of this that we can open source it. So what we ended up doing was coming up with a schema that looks something like this. And basically, it's just like you can have endpoints, and then you can have endpoints and endpoints, like group them. So this is like an example, a very basic example of an endpoint, right? You just you give it the name, and then you give what method to use, and then the path to hit, right? And then if you have like nested ones, like line items, for instance, like you just put other endpoints inside of that one. And then what we did was we basically added all these different resolvers that allow you to sort of hook into every step of a request. And so each one of these like allows you to like sort of manipulate how the request happens. And an example of what we do with this is, so we will actually like, in JavaScript, we prefer camel case, and then in Rails, obviously, we support snake case, right? And so we actually use these resolvers to sort of like translate our keys between the two languages. So that basically, like, when the response comes back, we convert it to camel case, and then before we send the data back to the API, we convert it to snake case. And so what we found is this is actually, like, we've been really happy with this, and it's actually really powerful. Like, we actually now use this for all of our APIs, and we've even written an SDK for a Saupe API using this. So it's like, we can actually do a lot with it. And this is something that you guys can all use right now. Like, it's open source. And you just go find it on NPM, right? And we think it's really cool that, and obviously, like, we've used this for Solidus. And one of the cool things about this is we made it support plugins, right? And basically what that is just like a subset or an extension of a schema, right? And so basically all you do is you just give it a name, and then you give it stuff inside an endpoints, right? And then what's cool is, like we have this example, right, like of reviews, right? We use reviews at Deseret Book. And so now we wrote this plugin, and then we just import it. And then when we initialize our instance of the SDK, like we give it the information, and then we give it a list of plugins. And then what we do is we sort of just like merge everything together. So it's like if you have, if you override like an order endpoint that like already exists in Solidus, you can just write a plugin, and then you can modify the way that the order endpoint works, or you can add additional ones. And they sort of just like all come together after you initialize it. And it basically allows us to add these extra endpoints. So this is something that we're really proud of, and this is something that you guys can start using today. It's called Solidus SDK, and you can find it on NPM. And basically, it's how we interact with the API currently at Deseret Book. And we have multiple apps that are using it currently. And we also open sourced our first plugin. So this is for the reviews gem. And so this is just one, like if you guys use a reviews gem and you want to use the API, like you can use this plugin right now. And we're currently using it. And so another one of the things that was important for us was documentation, right? And so because we now move to like a schema-based, it makes it so it's a lot easier for us to build documentation. So we have this cool doc site that hopefully like helps you guys to figure out how to like actually use it, right? And but really it's a work in progress still. Like we have all of the endpoints generated, but we don't have docs for all of them. So you'll end up seeing a lot of these things. But like if you guys are interested in getting into open source and want to like help write docs for this, like hopefully this is a good starting point, and you can sort of like help out. And we've even written like a contribution guide of ways that you can help make the API better, how you can help build documentation, and then hopefully how you guys can write your own plugins to support the extensions that are out there. So, you know, this is something that we felt was pretty good, right? Like the only one that has an asterisk is just that it's well documented, mostly just because we haven't gotten there yet, right? But like we have all the pieces in place. So this is one, you know, we're pretty happy with this. But, you know, at this point, like it's all sort of like hypothetical, right? Like you're like, this is great, Joel, but like I want to actually like see this in action. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through a few examples of actually using this in the wild, right? So what we have here, this is sort of just like our vanilla, like this is what you get when you start Solidus, right? Like this is Solidus front end. And then what we're going to do is we're going to change things on our thing, right? Like we're going to remove the authentication requirement. And then because we're going to have like our apps in separate places, like we actually run into CORS issues, and that sucks. And so anyway, we ended up adding this gem to like fix our CORS issues. So we're going to do that, and then so our first example that we're going to do is progressive web apps. And so what this example is built with create React app. And what I don't want to do is like talk about like how React works and how like any of that, right? Like I just want to show like how it works in this one context. But really this is something that can translate between like Angular or Vue, like any JavaScript thing that helps you build a web app, like it translates, right? And so basically all we do is we add our SDK to the app. And then we come over here, like this is our app, right? And so this section right here is sort of where we're going to manage our data. And then down here is like, this is where we tell it like to render those things, right? And so what we actually do is we just come in here, we import the SDK, right? And then we're going to create a new instance of it, and that's sort of like where we tell it like all the information, like where this is where our API is located. And then if we have any plugins and stuff, right? So then we do that, and then now like where we're actually fetching the data, like all we do is we just say, hey, like I want to get, so do Solidus, and then give me product and .all, right? And that says like, give me all the products. And then so we wait for that response to come back, and then once the response comes back, then we just say, hey, like UI, like update based on this new data that came back from the API. So anyway, so we start our app, right? And there we go, right? This is a create React app that is now pulling the same data as our Solidus front end app, but it's using this SDK, right? And that was pretty quick. Like this took, other than the UI, like pixel pushing and stuff, like took like 10 minutes to throw together, right? And so the next one, it's like that's great. Like we're in web, but like can we push the boundaries further, right? Like can we do native apps now? And so this example is using Expo, right? And so what Expo is, if you haven't heard of it, Expo is so Rails is a framework on top of Ruby, right? And so Expo is sort of a framework on top of React Native. So this is just like a React Native example, right? And it actually is, it basically follows the exact same principles, right? Like we add our package and then we have like where we manage data and then how we render it, right? And then we come in here and we import the SDK, and then we create a new instance, tell it where it's at and stuff, right? Like, and then we just go down and we make our request, and then we sort of take the data, and then we just tell it how to render it, right? But you know, now like what this is going to do, right, is this shows us that like now we have an iOS app or an Android app that uses Solidus, and so now like we can just take this and we can go and we can build native apps, and this was pretty quick, right? So this is like. Hopefully this shows like some of the power and take that we don't just have to have Solidus live the way that we're all used to it, right? Like we can take Solidus and we can move it further using the API and hopefully with the SDK. So what I want to do is do a little case study. Like if this isn't like enough to like jog your imagination, right? Like hopefully this is something you can go back and take to your boss and be like, we got to do this. So like I said, we started with checkout, right? That was the thing that we did. And so this is sort of like the flow of like the vanilla checkout, right? And these are all the steps in the state machine, and all these little gray lines are like page reloads, right? So it's like every user comes in, they hit the cart, then they hit the address, blah, 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 right? And we realized like that was like so painful for like because we have a lot of like frequent users that like come back and buy things all the time. And what we realized, like, what if we changed things? What if we were more like some of the bigger companies that sort of like bundle all these steps together and like remember things that we've done? And so what we do is like, we actually say, well, the cart's sort of optional, right? Like we'll dump users basically as far into the process as we possibly can. So all of our like recurring users come like directly to the payment step because we already know their address information. We already know their delivery information. You know, guest users and stuff, obviously we have to ask them their address, but this allows us to sort of like take each user and put them in a different place in the process, right? And when we did this, we ended up getting like a 7% increase in conversion, which at our company, we talk in Xboxes as currency, and what I'm told is that's a lot of Xboxes. So hopefully this is something you guys can go back to your boss and be like, hey, if we move to an API-based checkout, or if we start using the API to improve our user experience, like we could buy a lot of Xboxes. And that's what we talk about all the time is like, how many Xboxes can we get if we do this? And turns out it's a lot, it's a significant number of Xboxes. So really like this starts opening up the door like, well, if we can get all these Xboxes from checkout, like what more can we do? Like how can we take this API and expand it more? Like how can we build a better user experience in Solidus to hopefully allow all of our stores to have better conversion rate and to make more money, right? So really, I guess that opens the door. Like, what's next for Solidus because of this, right? Like, well, what about the front end? Like how do we update the front end to be able to use these things? And you know, this is basically another talk for another conference. But it's something for us to be thinking about. Like, what if we were to do UI kits? Basically meaning like, well, what if we had these common UI components in React or Vue or Angular, right? And they would utilize the API and basically make it a way that we can allow all of our developers to sort of like style them differently and modify them as our needs are, but to be able to like build a better experience and make it so it's easier for us to build these kind of stores. Or what if we were to use Gatsby? Gatsby has a thing called Gatsby Themes, which is basically like a way for us to there's sort of like modules on Gatsby, right? And so we could like make an eCommerce one for Solidus and allow like our front end to be completely in Gatsby. And this is a way that we could like leverage the UI and stuff, or leverage the API to build a better UI and build a better user experience. And really bring Solidus into like a more modern architecture and hopefully have something that sort of sets us apart from the other platforms. So we'll come back to the question of why not GraphQL? And you know what? I like to say, why not both? Really like, like they both serve different needs, right? And so GraphQL is cool, and it's something that we should think about and support, right? So we can do things like the Gatsby thing, but not every use case should require it, right? And we already have the API, and it's something that we should actively be trying to improve. And so really, like, there's a lot that we can do as a community to improve this, right? And hopefully this is something that we can all go back and be like, oh, how can I use the API more? Like, what can I apply to my stores to make them better, right? Like, can I leverage these tools that we learned about? And how can I help, right? Like, so that was sort of why we wrote the contribution guide. And really, like there's several issues with the API like currently open, right? And those are things that we can start tackling. But we can start looking for those missing pieces, right? And we can start like asking ourselves, how do we move our API into a more polished state, right? And then the documentation thing, like, how can I write more documentation? Like if you've never done open source before, like, this is the great place to start. It's just like figuring out how something works and then writing about it. And that like is super valuable, not only to like yourself and figuring out how it works, but just like to everybody. So the more documentation that we can write and how we can put these API endpoints together, like, will be super valuable to the community. And so anyway, my slides are up on sau.pe/Solidus 2019 if you guys want to go check them out and revisit these things, right? And then these are some of the API, or these are some of the resources that we hit, and obviously you'd have to go to the website to click on the links, right? But that's pretty much all I got. Does anybody have any questions? So he asked, what models do we feel are missing from, like, because only a third of them are like accessible from like my numbers. So basically what I noticed, like, I didn't really look too much into them. Like, we only hit the ones that we currently need, right? But I think the biggest ones that I've noticed are sort of like the admin things. Like, a lot of the endpoints are like, you can do a lot of the general user API. Like, you could build a pretty good user interface with the API right now. But if you started like wanting to do admin tools, like, we're getting into the point where it's like, oh, now we need admin tools to do some of these things like returns and stuff. Like, some of those kind of things like don't necessarily have the right kind of support, or that could be expanded. Which at the same time, you're like, why should I build a new admin like with an API like that? It already exists. Like, just make them use the admin, and that's fair, right? But it's something that like just for completeness, right? We should have those things. So, anybody else? All right. If anyone wants to talk to me after or at the hackathon and stuff, just hit me up. That's all I got. Thanks, guys.